Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're looking at this fascinating concept of love that binds. Basically, how the very things that bring us together can also, sometimes hold us back. And to help us unpack all this, we're diving into Abdul-Razak's book, Love That Binds, Paradox of Unity in a Single Consciousness. It's a pretty dense read, but it's packed with insight.
That's absolutely. And it's so relatable, too. I mean, think about it. Mm-hmm. Have you ever felt like one of those crabs in a bucket?
Yeah.
Where if one tries to climb out, all the others just pull it right back down. Well, Abdul-Razak argues that human groups, they're not really that different.
Yeah, that's such a powerful image. And it kind of makes you wonder, right? Like, what's the glue that's holding us all together? And at what point does that glue become, more like shackles?
Right, and that's exactly what Abdul-Razak digs into. He starts by acknowledging the good stuff about unity, like there's strength in numbers, right? That feeling of belonging, of being protected. Those are powerful forces. But then he kind of flips the script and he asks, what's the cost of all this? What are we giving up in exchange for that unity?
Okay, so let's talk about this invisible document he keeps mentioning. I gotta admit that phrase really grabbed my attention. It's a little spooky sounding, don't you think?
It is a bit, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's such a brilliant way to describe these unspoken agreements that shape every group. Think of it like this. You walk into any new environment, right? It could be a job, a club, a family gathering even. And immediately, there are all these unwritten rules, these shared beliefs about how things work, how people should behave. That's the invisible document in action.
So it's like we're all signing on to this contract without even realizing it.
Exactly. And this contract, it's often built on a shared love for a team, an ideology, a certain way of life. And that love can be a powerful shield, protecting the group from outside forces.
But it can also be a weapon. That's where things get really interesting to me. Abdul-Razak argues that this shared love can actually be used to combat anything that threatens the group's unity. It's like that saying, all's fair in love and war.
Exactly. And that's where we start to see this paradox unfold. The very same love that binds us together. It can also limit our individual growth. He calls this the consciousness leveling mechanism. Think of it like a thermostat, keeping everyone's thinking at the same temperature.
So no one gets too hot, no one gets too far ahead, but also no one gets too cold. No one falls too far behind. It's like that crab in the bucket thing all over again.
Precisely. We're conditioned to stay within certain bounds. And to enforce those bounds, groups develop these two really fascinating mechanisms. Abdul-Razak calls them filters and kill switches.
Okay, now I'm hooked. Tell me more about these filters and kill switches. They sound intense.
Well, the filters. Those are how groups screen out any ideas or information that don't align with the invisible document. They protect the group's shared reality, so to speak. The kill switch, on the other hand, that's a much more active response. It's what happens when something really challenges the group's core beliefs or threatens its unity in a serious way.
So it's like the alarm bells start ringing and the group goes into defense mode.
Exactly. Think about those intense sports rivalries. You see fans who are incredibly loyal to their team, which is great. But sometimes that loyalty, it can turn into aggression towards the opposing fans. It's like that kill switch gets flipped.
Yeah.
And suddenly it's us versus them, even if it's just a game.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like we're programmed to protect our tribe, even if it means shutting down anyone who disagrees. But what I find really fascinating is that Abdul-Razak says this isn't just a human thing. He says we see the same paradox playing out in nature too.
He does. And he uses some really intriguing examples from the animal kingdom, like ant colonies or beehives. They're incredibly unified, right? Working together for the survival of the colony. But there's also this real rigidity to their structure, this strict adherence to roles and hierarchies. Individuality is practically non-existent.
And he mentioned that experiment with the monkeys, right? Where they learn to avoid perfectly good bananas just because of a bad experience.
Oh, yeah. It's a classic study. It really shows the power of group conditioning. They basically spray this group of monkeys with water every time they try to reach for a banana. And eventually the monkeys, they learn to just avoid the bananas completely.
Yeah.
But here's the crazy part. When they introduce new monkeys to the group, those monkeys also avoid the bananas, even though they've never been sprayed.
Wow, that's wild. It's if the fear or the kill switch in this case gets passed down through the group, even though there's no logical reason for it anymore. So what does all this mean for us? For human society? Because I'm starting to see invisible documents and kill switches everywhere now. It's funny, before this deep dive, I never really thought about how much our desire to belong, to be part of a group could actually be holding us back. It's kind of mind-blowing.
It really is. And that's where Abdul-Razak brings up this idea of the expansion mechanism. He says that every living thing has this innate drive to grow, to evolve, to become more than it was before.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. Like, we're all striving to learn new things, push our boundaries, right? It's part of being human.
Exactly. But here's the thing. That drive for expansion, it often clashes with the group's need for unity. You see, when individuals try to break free from the mold, step outside the boundaries set by that invisible document, it can trigger that kill switch reaction we were talking about.
So it's like a double-edged sword. We crave growth. But when we actually try to achieve it, we risk being rejected by the very group we belong to.
Exactly. And the book gives some really compelling examples of this. One that really stuck with me was how in Ghanaian culture, people who achieve a really high level of success, they're sometimes suspected of belonging to secret societies or using dark magic.
Wait, really? Just because they're successful?
I know it sounds crazy, but the idea is that their success, it disrupts that collective consciousness. It makes other people uncomfortable because it challenges those established norms.
It's like that saying, the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. It seems like in a lot of cultures, there's this underlying fear of anyone who dares to be different, to achieve more than what's considered normal.
Absolutely. And think about how we sometimes even discourage kids who are too curious or too ambitious. We tell them things like, don't rock the boat or don't get ahead of yourself. It's subtle, but it reinforces that same message. Stay within the lines. Don't upset the balance.
Yeah, it's almost like we're training people from a young age to fear standing out, to fear that kill switch response.
Right. And to really illustrate this point, Abdul-Razak uses this powerful historical example, the story of Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first president.
Okay, yeah. I vaguely remember learning about him in history class, but refresh my memory. What makes his story so relevant to this whole love that binds idea?
Well, what's fascinating about Nkrumah is that he faced resistance, not just from colonial powers, but also from people within his own country. You see his vision for Ghana's independence. It was so expansive, so ahead of its time, that a lot of his contemporaries just couldn't grasp it. They saw him as a threat because his level of consciousness, his thinking, was just beyond what they were accustomed to.
So he was trying to lead his people to a better future, but his ideas were just too radical, too different from that prevailing thermostat setting of the time. And ultimately that led to his downfall. That's heartbreaking.
It is. Nkrumah's story is a real cautionary tale about the challenges of trying to bring about change. When your vision outpaces the collective consciousness of the group, he was a pioneer. But he paid a heavy price for being ahead of his time.
This is all pretty heavy stuff. I'm starting to wonder, if unity can be such a barrier to progress, is it even worth striving for? Should we all just become lone wolves, each on our own path?
That's a great question. And luckily, Abdul-Razak doesn't leave us hanging. He offers some really insightful ideas in the last few chapters of the book about how to navigate this whole paradox.
Okay, so there's hope. We don't have to choose between belonging and becoming.
Exactly. He doesn't advocate for abandoning unity altogether. Instead, he calls for a new consciousness, one that recognizes the limitations of our current way of thinking.
So like an upgrade to the operating system.
Perfect analogy. He argues that we need to develop this new awareness. That allows us to see both the benefits and the drawbacks of unity, to find a way to embrace individual growth and innovation, without automatically triggering that kill switch response in others.
Okay, I like this new consciousness idea. But how do we actually make that happen? It sounds pretty daunting.
It's definitely a challenge. But I think the key is to start small. Abdul-Razak encourages us to start by examining our own beliefs and behaviors, to ask ourselves, where do we see that kill switch mentality operating in our own WN lives?
You mean are we holding ourselves back from pursuing our goals because we're afraid of what others might think? Or are we judging others who are achieving more than us? Those are some tough questions.
Yeah, they are tough questions, but I guess that's the point, right? If we want to break free from this whole crab bucket mentality, we got to be willing to do some serious self-reflection.
Absolutely. Because remember, real growth, both individually and as a society, it requires us to step outside of those comfy, familiar boundaries, to embrace new ideas, even if they challenge the status quo. It's like Abdul-Razak is saying, hey, let's evolve our understanding of unity so it doesn't end up stifling our potential. So instead of pulling each other down, we start lifting each other up. Instead of seeing someone's success as a threat, we see it as something to learn from, to celebrate even. I like that.
Exactly. Imagine a world where we're genuinely excited for someone who's breaking new ground, pushing the limits of what's possible, where we ask, how did they do that? What can we learn from their journey? That's the kind of shift in consciousness Abdul-Razak is talking about.
Okay, that's a beautiful vision. But let's be real for a second. Competition is so deeply ingrained in everything we do, from school to work to, let's face it, social media. Is it even realistic to think we can just flip a switch and become a more collaborative, supportive society?
It's definitely a tall order, no doubt.
Mm-hmm.
But I love that Abdul-Razak doesn't just leave us with these lofty ideals. He actually offers some practical steps we can all take. He suggests starting by recognizing the value of collaboration over competition.
So instead of viewing someone who's doing well as an opponent, we see them as a potential collaborator, someone we can learn from, and maybe even achieve something bigger together.
Now you're getting it. It's not about eliminating competition altogether. A little healthy competition can be motivating, but it's about shifting the focus from competing against each other to collaborating towards shared goals.
So it's like, instead of a zero-sum game where only one person can win, we create a scenario where everyone benefits from each other's successes. We all rise together, like a tide lifting all boats. I love that metaphor.
And that brings us right back to Abdul-Razak's central message. This need for a new kind of unity. One that recognizes that we could achieve more together than we ever could alone. But also one that creates space for each individual to shine in their own unique way.
So it's about finding that sweet spot, that balance between the strength that comes from unity and the freedom that comes from individual growth. This deep dive has been a total eye-opener.
It has been fascinating, hasn't it? And I think the most important takeaway from Abdul-Razak's book is this. We all have the power to contribute to this new consciousness. It starts with each of us examining our own beliefs, challenging that kill switch mentality, and finding ways to support and celebrate the expansion of others.
That's a challenge I'm definitely up for, and I have a feeling our listeners are too. Because if we can learn to embrace both unity and expansion, well, the possibilities are truly limitless. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep growing